Okay, good morning, everybody. I've gone ahead and started the recording for today's session. All right, so it is 10 o'clock by my various devices here, so let's get started. Again, if we are dropped, if I'm dropped or if you're dropped and we can't successfully get back into the session after 5 minutes or so, just check for the recording and the information of this session online a little bit later on your Canvas site. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Uh, I'll try to not drag this out today. I know that the sessions have been a little bit more than an hour the last couple of sessions, and I want to try to get back onto a more lean focus here. So we'll see if I'll be able to manage it under an hour. Okay, so today, as we've done so far doing these particular sessions, I want to talk to you as to why we're doing these sessions this way. First, looking at the agenda. The purpose of the meeting, I will review today some key information and provide you guys an opportunity to ask some live questions. There were a couple of live questions that were just asked before we even started today's session, and I'll cycle back to review those in a little bit. We'll also today do a little bit of a review of exam number 4. There were some items there that I want to make sure that we have some clarity on, so we'll be doing that as well. And then we'll get into the meat of the matter of the day, focusing on chapter 13, which is on personality. So we'll do a summary overview of some of the material that you may have touched base with this week looking at the video lectures. And then we'll have more of a formal Q&A session if there are any more questions that you need to ask. Just a reminder of the course flow. We have assignments always. The idea is that you're to read those chapters, work on those quiz homeworks, review and annotate lecture notes, and then please respond to those video lecture discussions where I usually ask you to just select a particular topic and just tell me about it. This is one way that I can check to make sure that people are at least engaging to some degree with the video lectures. So please do that. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, I see a lot of people have already started using the chat feature. Send to me, the host, present, okay, just so I can make sure that you guys are getting a little bonus points when I start calculating these near the end of the term. Okay, so that's where we are so far. Let's go ahead and start off with a quick review of some of the items from our past test. Okay, so exam number 4, this is select item review. And again, the way this is done is I look at all the items from the classes and see if there were any ones that seem to not be answered in a way that I would expect them to be with regard to the percentage. And so for the most part, there really weren't many issues in this particular exam, as it has been for most of the exams that you guys have taken, because you've performed outstandingly on them so far. The average for this particular exam, focusing on motivation and emotion and social psychology, was an 89 over all my classes. So that's a good score. So just a little bit below the A level, but still the idea is that it's rather high for us. All right, so some of the items that I wanted to have some clarification on, and I'll spend a few minutes just talking about them now. There were several items, and one of the items focused on social loafing and then the factors involved in social loafing. So I wanted to spend a few minutes here just talking about what that is. First of all, what is social loafing? Some of you, most all of you, have had some experience with it to some extent, but it is the tendency of people in a group to show less effort when not held individually accountable. So you're in a group situation and one person may not do all that they could do for that group, and that's social loafing. And the key factor that I want to focus on here are why does that happen? And that's what I mean by factors involved in social loafing. Real quickly, it can simply be that the contribution is not rewarded or punished. And some people, if they don't feel like they're going to get punished for something or even rewarded for something personally, they're not going to want to contribute. Also, we see that you may feel your contribution is not needed. So you may feel like the group is going to do fine without you, so you don't have to put forth your effort to participate fully when it comes to that group project or that group assignment. The other item is you feel you'll get rewarded anyway. So no matter what you do, you're going to reap the benefits of it. So why even cause any sweat for yourself. Just lay back, relax, and let everyone else pull their weight. And then finally, we see also another part of it is if you're not part of a collectivist culture. A collectivist culture, again, is one of those cultures where they are really into the group perspective. They focus a lot on the group as opposed to the individual. And so obviously it makes sense if you are part of a collectivist culture that you feel more obligation to the group. Therefore, you're going to be a lot less likely to socially loaf. All right, so that's one of the items there. The other item, I just want to go ahead and remind us what we mean by prejudice. And of course, we see prejudice all over the place. It's not as blatant as it has been in the past, but prejudice is something that's part of all of us to some extent. And they come from, the components of prejudice are things such as our beliefs, which are going to be stemming sometimes from stereotypes. And stereotypes are somewhat difficult to try to avoid simply because it's the way our mind is sort of structured in some way. For example, let me give an example. You've had many classes. All of you have had numerous classes in your life so far. And when you go to that first meeting, that first class session, and the instructor starts to talk, you can already start to figure out what type of instructor that person's going to be. That's a stereotype. You have this stereotypical idea of different types of instructors, and you'll use your stereotypes in order to try to understand what category that instructor falls into. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. And why it's somewhat difficult to try to get past stereotypes is because our minds are designed to work that way to some extent. So our beliefs oftentimes can come from our stereotypes, and that's a component of prejudice. And then we have emotions, such things as fear or hostility. That's also a component of it as well. Something that you are afraid of, something you're not sure of. And sometimes when you don't know things or don't understand things, it can be somewhat fearful. And so that's a component as well. And then we have predispositions to act or discrimination. So when we look at prejudice, it has all these components. Generally speaking, when we think of prejudice, we think of it more of the attitude, which may include the fear and all this type of stuff. And that's one thing. But when it comes to your acting or behaving in a way based on those prejudicial attitudes, that's when it comes to discrimination. And that's what we normally have laws against when we do things like discriminating against people because of race or what have you for employment in certain jobs and occupations. Okay. All right, the other thing that we want to talk about real quickly here is benefits of belonging. There were a couple of items that focused on that in the last exam. I want to make sure that we understood why it is that we have this need for belonging, or as it's referred to in the text, a need for affiliation. Why is it that you want to have friends? Why is it that you want to belong to a group or a club? All right, so the reason behind it is because in the past, evolutionarily speaking, in the past, our ancestors were able to survive because of belonging. Okay, and so we inherited that characteristic through the ages. So why it is that we have this need for belonging is because belonging, being part of a group, allows for the following: mutual protection while we're in a group. We can help watch each other's backs. Cooperation in hunting and sharing food. Division of labor, emotional support in times of crises, and then also keeping children close to caregivers. So if we have all the children collected and we have collection of other adults around, they can help watch each other's children. So those are some of the benefits, evolutionarily speaking, and even now today, why it is that we still have this need for affiliation amongst us. Last couple of things: social facilitation impact on eating. Social facilitation, as you recall from the chapter on social psychology, is this tendency to enhance one's performance in the presence of other people. If you know the task really well, then your performance really goes up when other people are around. If you don't know it so well, it tends to go down because it causes anxiety. But it also has an influence on our eating behavior. We saw that in chapter 10. The presence of other people accentuates our typical eating habits. So you tend to eat a little bit more when you're around your friends or in some sort of large grouping. Then finally, we have the James Lang theory of emotion. I'll start this off by a quote from William James. We feel afraid because we tremble, sorry because we cry. And what that really gets to, what that quote of William James really gets to is this. He came up with the theory that our body changes, our physiological changes, like, for example, our heart starts to beat really, really fast. Once we become cognitively aware of that, we then become aware of that emotion. So if we are breathing fast, our heart's racing, then we say we are afraid to some degree based on those physiological changes. I'm going to pause there to see if there are any clarifications that you guys need before we move on to chapter 13. I'll pause for a few seconds. You can send me a chat or just speak up. All right, doesn't seem to be any questions there. So let's move on to the topic at hand here. The topic at hand excuse me, is personality. Personality. That's what we're going to be talking about. And in talking about personality, today we'll be looking at the following. We'll be focusing on Freud's or Freudian psychodynamic views, which really has a great deal of emphasis on the unconscious parts of the self. Then we'll look at the humanistic views of self-actualizing person. And then we'll close out with examining traits, including the big 5 factors and dimensions. We won't cover all the theories of personality to the same degree. After we cover the main ones, we'll look a little bit more, real gloss over real quickly at the remaining ones as well that are discussed in this chapter. So what is all this about? So these different perspectives and concepts can help us examine, one, what we have in common, the personality components, the basic drives, stages of development, and so on, and also the ways in which we differ. Individual paths that we take through stages, the ways that we manage our basic drives and needs, and the levels of trait dimensions that one person has that differs from another person. So what we're looking at here when it comes to personality and looking at all these theories, we're looking at ways in which we have things in common with other human beings, for example, and the ways that we are different from other human beings, how we are individually different from one another. So we cannot talk about personality without talking about Freud. And Freud is somewhat of a controversial figure, as we will see as we go through a few of these slides here. But why Freud is so important to us is that he was one of the first individuals to really develop a real comprehensive view of personality. Let's start off real quickly as what we mean by personality. A personality is an individual's characteristic patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors over time and across situations. Meaning that how you respond to a certain scenario 3 years ago and how you respond to it today may have some similarity because the personality we think probably wouldn't have changed that drastically. How you change your behavior may be indicative of the situation that you're in. For example, if you're in class, you're going to behave one way. If you're at a party, you probably will behave a different way. And if you're at church, you'll probably behave even a more different way. So these things do change, but you'll probably be very consistent when it comes to your church going behavior today as it will be 5 years from now. So the idea is personality tells us a lot about the ways in which people tend to behave, think, and feel given certain circumstances. So again, that's personality. Now, Freud gave us our very first comprehensive view of this thing. Now, what Freud was interested in was this. He was interested in the role of the unconscious. These are things which we are not aware of. Now, in a previous chapter, we talked about consciousness and the two-track mind, and we talked about the low road and the high road. The idea is that in one of those roads, we are fully aware of what's going on around us and with ourselves, but in the other road, we're not, and that's the unconscious one. So Freud was interested in trying to find out what role does the unconscious play in our daily life, in our ability to deal with scenarios or having particular types of issues. And that's what he wanted to explore. So he believed that the psychological could have some sort of impact on the physical. That means you can have some psychological issues that can cause you to be paralyzed. You can have some psychological issues that can cause you to be blind. And some of his patients had these symptoms, that they had blindness, but the blindness was not due to any physical issue. They were physically fine, but there was some sort of psychological issue that caused the physical concern. So Freud had the idea that these psychological issues, sometimes the patient or client was not fully aware of these issues, and they would bubble up and cause these physical symptoms in the particular patient. So that was one of the key ideas that he focused on, was trying to uncover those unconscious issues. Okay, so this led him to try to figure out about the personality, about the individual's characteristic patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. This led him to try to figure out the structure of the personality in personality development. So in talking about his structure of personality, we have to look to the right of this slide here and look at the iceberg. All right. The iceberg has, as a chief characteristic, is most of the iceberg, and the iceberg is like a big, huge ice cube floated in the ocean. And as it's floating, most of the ice cube, or the iceberg in this case, is going to be beneath the water. Okay. And only a small portion of it is going to be above the water. He used this iceberg analogy to describe a few key ideas of what he thought of as making up the structure of personality. First, he wanted to communicate the idea of the conscious and the unconscious. Things beneath the waterline represents the unconscious mind. Things above the waterline represents the conscious mind. Those are the things that we are aware of. You are consciously aware, for example, of what room you're in as you're listening to this presentation. Okay, you're aware of what room you're in. You're aware of how you're feeling for the most part. Do you feel warm, cool, what have you? That's your conscious awareness. But at the same time, there's going to be the unconscious. And from Freud's perspective, you have no real clue what's going on there. All right. So this leads us to what his therapeutic approach was all about. So it should be noted that Freud was trained to be a medical doctor, but what he wound up doing was working as a therapist. All right. And he developed a therapeutic approach referred to as psychoanalysis. And one of the key things for his approach of trying to uncover people's issues to make them feel better is to get at stuff in one's unconscious. So he had to get to the unconscious, because the basic belief was this: if you're able to find out things that are going on in your unconscious mind, bring them out to the light of day, then the patient will find some sort of relief in having this uncovered and having this issue that they weren't previously aware of being brought to the open for them so they can deal with it. That's the basic premise, and we'll see more about this in the next chapter and when we focus primarily on therapy. But here we're just looking at his therapeutic approach from a theoretical perspective. So how do you get to the unconscious? That was the challenge that Freud had. How do you get to the unconscious? Because people are not consciously aware of them. So this is what he did. There are a few approaches. One, hypnosis. Now, we touched on hypnosis in a previous chapter in Consciousness in the Two-Track Mind. Hypnosis is placing an individual in a state of heightened suggestibility, that they're so suggestible now. I mean, people can go through hypnosis so they don't feel pain when they go to a dentist's office. You know, people actually do that. So he was using hypnosis to try to ferret into the unconscious, to try to uncover the issues that may be going on with the person. He also used a technique of free association. just having people just start talking about things in an unguarded manner, so that sometimes they'd be able to say something that the therapist could then focus on and dive deeper into. And then he also came up with the idea of dream analysis. When one dream, they want to try to figure out if your dreams are representing things going on in your unconscious. And so by analyzing the dreams, they're able to get to those particular items. And I'll talk about those in a second here, but I want to now focus on another aspect of this personality that he came up with. So you see the iceberg, but also you have the consciousness above the water and unconscious below the water. But we also have things like the id and the superego. What Freud basically communicates is the idea that the id has a desire of its own. This is something that we're born with. So the personality develops from our efforts of our ego, and that's the one above the water. That's basically seen as you. You are the ego, and you're the one that tries to manage yourself in the real world. It's our rational self. And at the same time, the ego tries to resolve tension between the id, and the id operates on this pleasure principle. It wants what it wants, and it wants it now. So it's going to be the basic drives and needs that you have, the instinct that you have. Sometimes I can think of it sort of like as the beast in the basement. Whatever primal things that you want, that's what it drives. Its driving force are those types of things. You want food, you take it. You want something that you're walking by at the front of a department store window, you break the window, you take it. That's the id. The id has no control. Okay, it wants what it wants based on its biological drives. Okay, now it's the ego's job to try to deal with drives that may start to bubble up coming from the id, so you can control yourself. And then you have the superego, and the superego is going to be society's rules and constraints. So as you age, you will internalize these ideas of the rules and regulations. This next slide will probably take care of that a little bit more to give you some clarity. All right. But before I go to the next slide, let's talk real quickly about dream analysis and free association, all this type of stuff. So Freud's idea was to try to get at the unconscious. He can use hypnosis or free association. In dream analysis, his belief was your dreams are going to be wish fulfillment. It's going to be a lot of things that you find unacceptable, okay, that sometimes bubble up in your dreams. And so he can analyze your dreams so that he can try to uncover what those things are. Now, let me get go ahead.
So you're saying that in the way dream is like great, like in his theory, dreams are like what is the manifestation of what we desire in our unconscious?
Exactly. So the idea is that he was believing that things pop up in your dreams because you're not guarding yourself at night while you're sleeping. And he wants to try to understand what the dreams are. And so he came up with this idea that you have your manifest content and your latent content. All right. The manifest content of a dream is you got up in the morning, you opened your door to your apartment, and you weren't where you're supposed to be. The world was different. There was a black void out there. So the idea, that's what happened in your dream. That's the manifest content of your dream. That's what happened. But what he wants to analyze then is what is the latent content of your dream? What does your dream really mean? So then he would start looking for symbolism. The therapist would look for symbols. So when you open that door and you saw this black chasm of nothingness, that meant something. So he would try to find out what that actually meant. And his thought was he was getting that from your unconscious. So most of his theory and his therapeutic approach would be to try to get to things in your unconscious that you're not aware of that's causing issues with your daily life. Okay?
I see.
Okay, so that's the basic idea there. Now let's look about what and how this stuff develops. So the developing personality, this is the way Freud viewed it. First, when we are born, we start life with a personality made up of the id exclusively. striving impulsively to meet basic needs, living by the pleasure principle. As you know, as a young kid starting to be able to crawl around the floor, they do whatever they want. They don't have things that sort of guard their behavior. They see something that looks tasty on the floor, they pick it up with their little chubby hands and shove it in their mouth. That's what they do, impulsively, whatever. They do it. Then what happens is this. Then you become a toddler. You're a little bit older. An ego develops, a self that has thoughts and judgments, memories following a reality principle. Think about it this way. When you're at a certain age, you could be at a department store and you run away from your, let's say you're able to walk and run away, and you run away from your mama and you were half clothed. You don't care. You just run around buck naked in the department store. You don't care. You have no real sense of self yet. Okay. And basically you have thoughts and judgments, but you're not fully formed yet. You don't fully form in this theory until this next stage, where around age 4 or 5, the child develops the superego, a conscience internalized from parents and society following the morality principle. Basically, what this is saying now, you understand rules, you understand regulations enough that you know that if you do certain things, you'll get punished. Okay, if you do certain things, maybe you'll get rewarded, but you understand. So around
Quick,
4 to go ahead now.
which stage was it that which the child like for male development is the feel like their father is a rival?
That will be the phallic stage, and we'll get into that in the next slide, I believe. Okay. All right. So basically, what he's referring to are the psychosexual stages of development that Freud came up with, and this is one of the reasons he is seen as somewhat of a controversial figure. So what we see as the personality develops, the ego, and that's your rational self, is working and this on this three-part system to manage bodily needs. So you have to deal with the real world and wishes in a socially acceptable way. So the id is driving you to do things that it wants biologically. The superego is trying to make sure that you do everything according to all the rules and regulations. And the ego is trying to manage all this type of stuff. I don't know if they still do it, but a long time ago, there used to be cartoons and TV shows where the key figure would have some sort of decision point. They could do something good or do something bad. And then all of a sudden, an angel would pop up on one of their shoulders, and then a little devil would pop up on the other shoulder. So one represents the id, that's the little devil, and the superego represents the little angel over one of your shoulders. You are the ego in the middle, and you're the one who has to make the decision. So you're managing between these super moralistic superego and the beast in the basement id that wants things when it wants it and doesn't care about rules, and you're trying to
Wait,
manage.
you saying so the ed is basically like the rule follower, while the super ego is like the one for desire?
The super ego is the one that's trying to control you. It's saying you must, oh, it's their grandmother's voice saying this. You must don't do always do the right thing, Johnny. Do the right thing. Don't disappoint me. So that's when you hear your mother's voice, your grandmother's voice, you have internalized the rules as they see the rules. So the
And that's
parents,
super ego.
that's the super ego. The id, all the id wants is whatever pleases it at that time. That's all the id cares about. And the id will
So
give you,
wouldn't the ed be the devil?
so now,
Wouldn't the ed be the devil in a
yeah,
way?
yeah, the id would represent the little, as the little scenario I gave you, the id would represent the little devil. The super ego would be representing the little angel. Okay.
Okay, I got it now. One,
Okay.
so now I got the difference between the two. One is like based on desire, where the other one's based on like what's
Rules.
right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Morality.
Rules.
Exactly. So that's the way that works. So now, as was mentioned earlier, he mentioned that the stages of development. And so before I show you the stages of development, let's talk about the following. So Freud came up with this theory of psychosexual development, the stages of this development. This is how he saw the personality develop. We talked about the big picture in the last slide, but now he focuses on the details. First, he says the id focuses its needs on these things. You've probably heard of the term before, erogenous zones. And these are sensitive areas of the body referred to as erogenous zones, where we focus, where we have attention, and we get pleasure from them. So people feel shame about these needs and can get fixated at one stage and never resolve how to manage needs of that zones. So the idea here is this: as we go through these stages, the erogenous zones through the developing child may change. If we go through the stage successfully, we just move on. We know how to deal with that particular erogenous zone and move on. But sometimes we can get fixated. All right. So here are the stages per Freud. So he says that the first stage of development is the oral stage from 0 to 18 months. The focus of our pleasure centers on the mouth. So at that stage, in that age group, it's all about sucking, biting, and chewing. Everything's sitting around the mouth. And to some degree, anecdotally, we sort of understand that, because I was describing to you earlier, you have a kid crawling around the floor, they pick something up, they're shoving it 9 times out of 10 into their mouth. That's where they have the pleasure of the world there. All right. Then the next stage from 18 to 36 months, this also includes the terrible twos, is called the anal stage of development. Here, the pleasure focuses on bowel and bladder elimination, being able to control the elimination process. This is all about demands of control. All right. Then we have the phallic stage, 3 to 6 years approximately. Here, the pleasure center is on the genitals, coping with incestuous sexual feelings. Yes, I said incestuous sexual feelings, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. But the idea, and this is where we have the very controversial aspect of Freud's theory. He sort of saw kids at this early age having certain types of feelings that people were not comfortable with them having. Then we go to the next stage called the latency stage, which occurs 6 years up until the start of puberty. Okay, here there are no sexual feelings whatsoever. It's sort of dormant feelings when it comes to sex. Then after puberty on to adulthood, we have the genital stage where we have maturation of sexual interest. So what he's basically saying is this: development is going to be driven by the id to a certain extent. Okay, because remember, this is core to his theory of personality. We have the id that has all these basic needs. And as we age, the erogenous zones, the focus of these needs will sort of move around. All right, from oral to anal to phallic to latency to genital and all this type of stuff. And so as we go through each stage, we can successfully get through all of them, hopefully. But if they doesn't happen, then you could have people who grow up to be adults who never completely got out of a particular stage of development, and that's when we refer to them as being fixated. So someone who's orally fixated, for example, as an adult, they always have to have something in their mouth. A straw, a toothpick, they're always chewing gum, so on and so forth. All right, so they would say oral fixation. Anal fixation, you may have heard of anal retentive or anal expulsive. Anal retentive usually is someone who's very controlling. They're usually particularly very, very neat. Okay, anal expulsive, the exactly opposite, not very neat whatsoever. So we see that this is what he's talking about, these types of fixations. Now, when it comes to the phallic stage of development, and this is the one where we have the most controversial. This next one here is this. Freud believed that as boys in the phallic stage seek genital stimulation, this their erogenous zone, they began to develop unconscious sexual desires for their mothers and hate their fathers as a rival. I'll let that sink in for a second. So basically the idea, and they have the same idea basically for girls as well, that they seek have certain types of feelings, although maybe unconscious, for their father and see their mother as a rival. Okay, so that is what he saw as a major complex. He referred to it as the Oedipus complex, all right? The Oedipus complex. And with the Oedipus complex, the only way that you can really resolve it is for you to no longer see the same-sex parent as a rival, but see them more as a role model. So in this instance, the father is not seen as somebody who he is in competition with for the mother, but someone that he can learn to model themselves after. Why it is referred to as the Oedipus complex is the following. It's a Greek story. I'll probably massacre it, but what it comes down to, a young man kills this older man traveling one day. He turns out that he was a king, and so he takes over the guy's kingdom. He doesn't realize until later that the guy that he killed earlier was his father that had given him up years ago, and that the woman that he's now taken for his wife, who was the queen of the one that the king that he killed, happens to be his mother. So he's now married to his mother. That's the story from the Greek tragedy, and that's why that comes up as the Oedipus complex. Describe that.
Oh,
Yes.
I see. That's why it's familiar.
Yes. All right. So that's the idea and why he used that terminology to describe this particular complex. Normally, when it comes to females, it's usually referred to, I believe, as the Electra complex. And there's lots of other things too that I won't go into because they'll just get into a longer conversation here. But this also deals with things like penis envy and castration anxiety. It all plays into Freud's psychosexual stages of development and the issues that result from it. So this is why oftentimes people will have some issues with Sigmund Freud because of this particular theory that he came up with about our developing our personality. All right, so the other aspect is the following. So we have this ego, which is you, and you are supposed to deal with all the issues of the world and deal with your somewhat irascible id and ego, super ego. But sometimes things can cause anxiety in you. And Freud believed that we are anxious about our unacceptable wishes and impulses, and we repress this anxiety with the help of a certain type of strategy. These strategies are usually referred to as defense mechanisms. And basically what happens is this: if something uncomfortable happens, that you're having some thought or desire that you do not like or appreciate some way, then you can use one of these defense mechanisms to push it out of your mind so that you can
So,
go for it.
so with anxiety, you basically in any situation you that your mind, like for example, to not explain unconscious process or anything, is like a defense mechanism, like to protect what your unconscious.
Well, let's say you have a certain type of. Let me give you an example. This may clear it up. Each one of these defense mechanisms you see here is a type of way in which we hide something that is unacceptable to us. All right, let's go with one here: denial at the very bottom, refusing to believe or even perceive painful realities. I may have given this story in the lecture, but let me see if I can do it again. The idea is this: let's say you have some young adults, and you are two females, and one female is visiting a friend of hers, and she's doing some chores around the house and everything, and you've known this friend for some time, and she doesn't wear a stick of a bit of makeup whatsoever, no lipstick, nothing. She has no makeup on her face at all. And so she's doing laundry, and you're hanging out with her, just shooting the breeze and all this type of stuff, and then you see her take one of her husband's shirts, and you notice on the collar of her husband's shirt is some lipstick. Does anybody know what that means? Possibly. Anyone? Well, I'll walk you through it. If this woman who's married to this guy doesn't wear any lipstick at all, doesn't wear any type of makeup whatsoever, so where is the lipstick coming from her husband's collar? Why is there a lipstick on his collar? So the friend notices this. Her mouth falls open, and her eyes go wide as she realizes what the implication is. But what the friend does, he just puts the solution on the lipstick on the collar, put some stuff in it, and puts it into into the washer without thinking about it whatsoever. That may be a sign of denial. What that basically means is, even though the evidence is there right in front of you, you consciously do not make the connection. You push it out of your mind. It has become something that is a non-entity. The other example would be something that we do a lot of here, rationalization. So let's say you're walking around your neighborhood and you see there's an envelope on the floor, on the ground. You pick it up and it's loaded with $100 bills. So there's like $10,000 in there. What do you do? Do you try to find someone to give this money to, the rightful owner, or do you keep it? This is going to be one of those scenarios where you have the angel on one shoulder and the little devil on the other. But the idea, let's say you keep the money. You keep the money. So now your super ego, the little angel, is going to be a little bit upset with you. But you have to be able to deal with yourself and deal with the anxiety that may cause. And so you may start to rationalize, you know what? That money was probably the result of drug deals. So it's drug money. So it's a really good thing for me not to get this money back to the rightful owner, because all it's going to do is hurt my neighborhood. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can understand these. Actually, these reactions I can actually relate the most. For example, reaction formation, realization, displacement, and
Yes.
I actually went through those a lot actually.
Yeah. Well, obviously, this is one of the reasons why people really caught on to Freud, even though he had some aspects of his theory that people really didn't like, is because people could relate to him. Because we all have used at one point or another several of these defense mechanisms, I'm certain. So the idea is that these defense mechanisms are there to help protect us from unacceptable wishes or impulses or things that we don't like about ourselves. So we have this anxiety, and so we have these defense mechanisms to sort of protect us. So that's the key idea that we want to produce here. So Freud was a key figure. And even though he came up with some theories that people did not like, and even though we have waited, we have for a long time seen the results of his theories, and people have had some issues with his research methodology, we still talk about Freud all the time because he really did help to put psychology on the map, so to speak. But it was not without some issues, because as we look now, there are plenty of flaws in Freud's scientific method. He really wasn't a hardcore scientist. He used patients that he had access to who had some really serious issues to develop his theory. So here are some of the flaws in Freud's scientific method. First, unfalsifiability. He developed theories that are hard to prove or to disprove. So the idea is this: in science, we have to be able to prove something to be false or not false. Okay, and because the way his theory was designed, it can almost prove anything. It was basically unfalsifiable, so it really does not hold to the scientific method that much. And then we have the unrepresentative sample. Most of his patients are the ways that he came up with his theories. So he did not build his theories on a broad sample of observations. He described all humanity based on people with these unusual psychological problems. People who were blind, they couldn't see, but there was no physical reason they couldn't see. All right. So this is the key idea. So the notion also is that it was biased observations. He based theories on his patients, which may give him an incentive to see them as unwell before his treatment. So he had some potential bias already built into it. And finally, post facto explanations. Freud did not make predictions. He did not say in a few years when this kid grows up, he's going to have these issues. He didn't do that. He made postdictions. Okay, so he had hindsight bias. All right, so whether or not a situation makes you anxious or not, you can either be fixated or repressing. So he came up with ways to explain both individuals. And by doing that, he made it difficult for this to be seen in a very scientific way. So unfalsifiability, unrepresentative sample, biased observation, and post facto explanations are ways in which there are many flaws in the ways that Freud came up with his theory based on his lack of scientific methodology that he utilized when he came up with these approaches. All right. So that's Freud. And we spent a lot of time on Freud because he is a key figure that really put us on the map as a discipline, and people do talk about him still today. A lot of his ideas, Freudian slip, dream analysis, all these things are still part of our language and our culture hundreds of years after he did his work. All right. So the next theory we want to talk about is the humanistic theories of personality. Now, let me give you the background here. So during the 60s, the 1960s, what we saw was two major movements in the world of psychology. We have behaviorism, which we talked about in the previous chapter, and then we had psychodynamic thought, Freud's ideas. And some researchers and some psychologists, such as Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, start to become dissatisfied and began to reject some of the ideas that these two movements made about humanity. So basically, the dehumanizing ideas of behaviorism, because all they wanted to say is that if we can control the consequences of behavior, we can control the individual. That's what they basically stated. And then the dysfunctional view of the psychodynamic perspective, where Freud basically says that we don't even know why it is that we do some of the types of things we do, because the unconscious and the unconscious issues are causing all these types of things. And so control and power was being taken away from human beings, and Maslow and Rogers did not like that. So what they did is they sought to establish a third force in psychology, a third movement. And this movement and this force is called the humanistic perspective. So they wanted to look at it totally differently, and they sort of flipped the script. And basically they did something somewhat unique. They studied healthy people. They studied healthy people rather than people with mental
Really?
health problems. Yes, they studied healthy people. So they flipped the script entirely. So they were saying, you know what? They're studying all these people with all these issues and coming with all this dire gloom. And we want to look at people who are seen to be healthy and want to establish what makes them so healthy. So their technique and approach was somewhat different. So from humanism, focusing on the conditions that support healthy personal growth. If you go
So this will go into self-determination and self-esteem?
Exactly. So if people still do go to bookstores, if you go to a bookstore, you'll see sections that say self-improvement or self-help. Oftentimes, the majority of those books there will fall into this category of humanistic theories of personality of Maslow and Carl Rogers. These were the guys who really started that type of movement to really focus on those things about making people healthier by way of making them figure out ways in which they can grow themselves in a very positive way. So
Wouldn't I have a question? Wouldn't they encounter people that wouldn't be not healthy? Because like in today's world, there's healthy people, but sometimes they may seem healthy, but in the end, they have problems inside of them. Would
that
they?
that
Would they have encountered that?
that is true, but what they would do is they would be looking at them sort of like aspects of an individual. So he is healthy in this regard. Does that make sense? And so they try to find out how it is that this person has achieved this. Okay, so they're studying people who, if they give a bunch of people an MMPI, a personality survey, and all this type of stuff, and they're able to determine that these people do not suffer from these issues, then they can analyze those people more carefully and find out what is in their life. And that's what they did. They wanted to find out what was in their life that led them to become these more healthy people. And that led to the following. In Maslow's view, people are motivated to keep moving up the hierarchy of needs, growing beyond getting basic needs met. And we've seen this pyramid before. Okay, so basically the notion is at the top of this hierarchy are self-actualization, fulfilling one's potential, okay, becoming the best person that you can become. So in order to do that, what Maslow basically stated is that you need to be able to have no worries about the needs below you. So you have to have your physiological needs, safety needs, and belonging needs met before you can worry about esteem needs. But one of the key prizes is when you get to self-actualization. With self-actualization, that's basically saying is that you are becoming, you're optimizing the person that you could be. You're becoming the best version of yourself. Okay, you have become self-actualized. You're fulfilling your potential. So in this ideal state, a personality includes being self-aware, self-accepting, open, ethical, spontaneous, loving, caring, focusing on a greater mission than social acceptance. And then at the very top of that, we see this added a little bit later, is self-transcendence. That now you realize that there are things even greater than yourself. So you've already achieved your self-actualization, but self-transcendence basically means that there are things that you're willing to sacrifice for because there are things more important than you physically and your self-happiness and all this type of stuff. So this is what he sees as the ultimate as we sort of develop our personality. So he sort of sets the stage. Now, Carl Rogers follows that up with the following. Rogers agreed that people have this natural tendency to grow, become healthy, and move towards this self-actualization. But there are three conditions that can facilitate this growth, according to Carl Rogers. Okay, and these were the conditions. That one, we have genuineness, being honest, direct, not using the facade, not having a false face. So when you are really open and direct with people, that you are genuine. When you meet somebody and you know they're not, as they used to say, putting on airs or pretending or fronting or whatever the case may be, this person is who they say they are. They are an honest person. They are genuine. The other idea is acceptance. The notion of unconditional positive regard, acknowledging feelings without passing judgment. Somebody can do something that could hurt your feelings, but you can also not pass judgment on them or not say that they are an evil person because they did it. So we have genuineness, acceptance, including this idea of unconditional positive regard. Let me focus on unconditional positive regard really quickly. What we mean by unconditional is that you are going to give somebody this without conditions. For example, let's say you have a college student that's going away for who's in college, they're living away from home, and then the parents find out that they switched their majors, and their parents were fully for them to go into accounting, and now you realize that you dropped out of accounting school. Why did you do something like that? So unconditional positive regard would say they don't necessarily like what you did by way of dropping out of the accounting, but they still love you, still have positive regard for you. The opposite of that would be, well, if you dropped out of accounting, there's no need for you to come home for Christmas. If the parents say something like that, they're demonstrating conditional positive regard. They'll only give you positive regard if you do what they want you to. That's love in a way with conditions. So genuineness, being open and honest, acceptance, looking at unconditional positive regard, and then finally empathy, tuning into the feelings of others, showing your efforts to understand and to listen well. So what Rogers did, he basically said, in order to get to this idea of self-actualization as Maslow envisioned it, you have to do these types of things. You have to be able to get genuine, be accepting, and be empathetic. And he also saw this as part of his therapy, as we'll see a little bit later in chapter, when we get to the next chapter, that the same approach is used for his therapeutic approach as well. All right, before I move on, are there any questions to that? Okay, cool. All right, so the notion then is,
I was trying to ask. I was trying to ask. So all these three things are like the same.
Are they the same? You said they.
Like, are these three things is basically how we think about it, like self-actualization, like how we think, like for example, the genuineness of being honest, or the acceptance
Well,
of being positive regard, and empathy.
Yeah, think about it this way: is that what Carl Rogers was doing was building on the idea of Abraham Maslow. He says, yes, I agree that we have this natural tendencies to grow and become healthy, moving towards self-actualization. But he saw that these three conditions, being someone, I mean, for example, let's say you're meeting someone for a first date or something. Someone who's going to be very open and honest. They're not putting on airs about who they are, what they've done. They're being very genuine. Who they are is what they're showing you. They're being very acceptance. They acknowledge your feelings without passing judgment. Yeah, maybe you had some trouble with the law in the past, but again, they're not passing judgment on you. And then empathy, tuning into your feelings. They are really caring about what your thoughts are and what your feelings are. One aspect of that, real quickly before I forget, when it comes to empathy, it talks about listening well. Let's be honest, when you're talking to somebody, sometimes you'll lose a bit of the conversation because you are already planning on what you're going to say to them next. Now, I won't even ask you because I know everyone does it. You're planning on what you're going to say to them next. But there's this thing called active listening, which teaches people how to really engage in listening to people. That's how you show empathy. You really want to see things from their perspective, want to make sure that you understand what they're telling you. So you do not try to pretend that you're listening. You truly do listen. You don't plan on what you're going to say next to them. You're listening to every word coming out of their mouth. And then with active listening, as soon as they finish, you then paraphrase. So what you're telling me is bam, bam, bam. And that means you feel bam, bam, bam. And then you wait and they say, exactly. That's exactly what I was telling you. That is one of the best things when it comes to relating to other people, to truly, fully understanding them. And that's one of the aspects there. So these things are slightly different when it comes to each one of them, but it sort of fits the same goal that Maslow had and Rogers saw too, that it helps with relationships. It helps with you understanding who you are. Even though we're not going to cover it today, if you look in this particular, the notes as well as the chapter, the idea of self and ideal self and actual self, that's part of it too. If you feel like you're living a lie, then you're going to have some issues. But if you feel like who you say you are and who you really are aligned, then that's usually going to be a much more positive for the person. All right. So the next idea that I want to cover is going to be the next theory of personality, and that's going to be the trait theory of personality. And so Gordon Allport decided that Freud overvalued unconscious motives. Remember, Freud was all about the unconscious and undervalued real observable personality styles and traits. So what Allport was basically saying was this: Freud was focused too much on the things that we couldn't see. I want to look at things that we can see. Personality styles and traits which are observable, things that we can count. So he wanted to focus on that. And one of the individuals that did that was Myers and Briggs. They wanted to study individual behaviors and statements to find how people differed in personality, having these different types of traits. So they formed this thing called the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, a questionnaire categorizing people by traits. So what is a trait? A trait is an enduring quality that makes a person tend to act a certain way. And that's why we're talking about it in personality. That's a strong component of personality. So examples would be this: you may know friends that you have that you would characterize their traits as, oh yeah, John, he's honest. Elizabeth, she's shy. Arthur, he's very hardworking. So these are traits that we can see in people. And so what they were interested in doing here is trying to figure out how it is that we could measure these types of traits. So the MBTI traits come in pairs. You can be seen as judging or perceiving, thinking or feeling. All right. So in trait theory of personality, that we are made up of a collection of traits, behavioral predispositions that can be identified, measured, and traits that differ from one person to another. So again, if you take a trait personality survey like the MBTI, it rates you on several levels. For example, at the bottom left of this slide, you can see energy. That's going to be extroversion versus introversion. Extroversion, someone who's very outgoing, the life of the party. The introvert, someone who's a little bit more reserved, somewhat calm. Learning, senses versus intuition. Do you use your senses to try to perceive what's going on, to learn what's going on, or do you feel the gut feeling, use intuition? How do you make decisions? Do you think things through to make decisions, or do you feel what the right decision is? Relating, okay, do you perceive or are you judging? So the idea here is by looking at all these different types of traits, they can develop certain profiles. For example, we have ENTJ, someone who's an extrovert, uses intuition, thinking and judging. And usually these types of profiles have been associated with certain types of jobs and capabilities. For example, ENTJs are usually going to be related more to good executives working for businesses and things of that nature. So by looking at traits, by how people actually tend to behave, and we can come up with ideas too about personality. Now, hopefully this gives you a little bit clearer idea of this next few slides here. When they did all this research on personalities, they kept seeing these few dimensions keep popping up all the time. The big five personality factors. So the Eisniks, a couple of researchers, the Eisniks felt that people varied among two dimensions. Current cross-cultural research and theory supports an expansion of the two dimensions into five factors. So we kept doing all this research all the time, and we kept seeing that we kept bumping into these types of personality traits: conscientiousness, self-discipline, careful pursuit of delayed goals; agreeableness, helping, trusting, friendliness; neuroticism, your level of anxiety, insecurity, or emotional instability; openness, your flexibility, nonconformity, your variety; extroversion, drawing energy from others, being sociable. So that's what they saw. So these became the big five personality factors. Okay. And one way you can remember them is CANOE. CANOE. C for conscientiousness, A for agreeableness, N for neuroticism, O for openness, and E for extroversion. There are others out there too, but this is one that we can use here. So the idea is that we can measure people on these big five factors. Let me give you another idea how it can be done. Now, we all are aware that dogs have different personalities. Dogs can be judged on this type of thing too, just to give you an example. So we can see a dog that can be considered to be impulsive, trusting, anxious, conforming, and fun-loving. We can do the same thing with a person. So we can rate each person on their level of conscientiousness. Do they fall more toward the disorganized or the organized? Their level of agreeableness. Are they more suspicious or more trusting? Their level of neuroticism. Are they calm or insecure? Their level of openness. Are they more conforming or are they more imaginative? The level of extroversion. Are they more reserved or are they more sociable? By measuring each one of these on these dimensions, we can get an idea of what type of person this individual may be. The notion here as well is this: certain individuals may be better suited for certain types of jobs. Okay, so a lot of companies these days are using personality tests in order to get an idea as to who they want to hire. So what we found out following the research is this: one's distinct mix of traits doesn't change much over the lifespan. However, as we become older, we become more conscientious and more agreeable. We become less extroverted and less neurotic and unstable and less open. So we become less flexible as we get older. And that's what we tend to think. Stereotypically, older folks are usually the ones who are not going to be as open-minded and as flexible as younger folks. The predictive values: levels of success in working relationships relates to traits such as openness. So if you are open and you're conscientious, then we tend to see better work and better relationships. So we do see that this trait stuff has some practicality or some practical implications as well. Okay, so other types of things too when it comes to traits: heritability. For most traits and genes account for 50% of the variation among individuals. So basically what it comes down to is that 50% of who we are when it comes to these traits seems to be based on our genes, nature, and the rest on nurture, how it is in our environment, what we have learned and things of that nature. So no big whoop there. All right, so as we wrap things up here, I want to go over real quickly this idea of the biopsychosocial approaches to personality. Just remind us that we have biological influences, psychological influences, and social cultural influences that impact our personality. Now, the other thing I want to cover real quickly is just reviewing some of the things that we did not cover to the same degree. We have the psychoanalytic personality theory, which is going to be what we saw with Freud. We did not cover the psychodynamic, which are going to be the neo-Freudians, the people who followed up with Freud but did not have the same ideas. And for the most part, how they differ from Freud was this: they went away totally from the idea and focused on sex that Freud had in his particular theory. So Adler, Horney, Jung, and even another Freud, Anna Freud, would be considered neo-Freudians, and they use the psychodynamic approach. We did go over humanistic, and we did go over trait theory. We didn't go over social cognitive, which is Albert Bandura. And basically the idea here is that our traits in the social context interact to produce our behaviors, and so they sort of influence each other. All right, so that's one of the key things I wanted to make sure that we covered doing this particular get together in this check-in. So that's it. I'm going to leave it open for you guys to see if there are any questions that you have of me. I want to tell you right now that I am starting to review your current event papers, and a little bit later, once I get most of those done, I'll probably do a little bit of presentation for that, and probably talk a little bit about that as well the next time we get together. All right, are there any questions right now? Okay, we are 3 minutes over the hour that I wanted to keep us under. So if there are no other questions now, you guys are free to start rolling out. And I will see you a little bit later next week for sure. If not, try to contact me for an office hour or whatever if you need to. Other than that, you guys have a great day, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Huh?